If you are like me, you have older consoles that you sometimes just want to hook up to an older TV to play them. Now, you have more enthusiast solution, like an OSSC, that is quite expensive, or cheaper solutions, such as an AV2HDMI converter, or something more specific, like this PS2 to HDMI converter. Now, something I've seen floating around for quite a while now is this Retroscaler2X, which is basically like a RetroTink clone. And as such, I've tested this. I don't have an actual RetroTink to compare it to, but I think the results on their own will give you enough of an idea if you want to buy this or not. Now, first of all, what is in the box? In the box itself, you get a little invitation to their Discord and to their official store, a little manual, which is in color and in English, quite nice. The device itself, which is a bit hard to take out, and a USB-A to micro USB cable. Now, one big thing that is very important about this device is the supported video formats, which are 240p and 480i, 288i, and 576i. This means something like a PlayStation 2 might not necessarily be supported, even if you force it into 480p with FreeMake boot. So you will not get the best quality out of all the consoles, and you need to be aware what your console is outputting. With that being said, let's get into the device. For what it's worth, it feels actually quite good. The buttons feel good, the shell is pretty nice, it doesn't really flex too hard, and everything they have here is pretty solid. Some of these can be quite cheap feeling and loose, as you might see here. And it supports composite, component, S-video, and outputs it to HDMI, of course. And you also have some smoothing modes, but I will get to them in the comparison. Now, one thing I noticed when testing it is when we talk about the input modes. You have YPBR, which is, the component. You have CVBS, which is the composite, and of course S-video, but you also have a mode which activates all of them. I do not recommend this mode. It works, you can hot plug between the different modes, but the signal does look worse if all of them are active at the same time. So if you choose one mode, go with that one specifically. So now I get into the actual devices I've tested. I've tested the N64, the PlayStation 2, the PSP, and the SNES. Now, something I need to mention about the comparison footage is that the Retroscaler2X looks a bit darker than the AV2HDMI. This is not because of the devices themselves, but because of my capture card. On the monitor, this looks absolutely fine, and this looks a bit too exposed. And that's the difference that you see, but with my capture card, all of it looks a bit darker, which makes this look better and this looks worse. Just so you know. Now I get to the tests themselves. For all of these, the output will not fill out your entire monitor, which is quite common with these devices. So I will leave them as is. Now, first was the N64. Without the 2X or the fill activated, it looks a bit blurry and has some weird flickering around the edges of icons. But overall, for plug and play, it looks alright. Then with the 2X, it does look a bit better, but it's still blurry and the flicker is still there. Then with the fill activated, it looks a bit better than the 2X, but it's still not very good. And next up, I get to the AV2HDMI. And honestly, it is just horrendous. So for the N64, I have to say the RS2X with the 2X fill activated is probably the best solution. Then next I get into the PS2. On the RS2X, there's some weird wobbling, especially around the numbers and text, and a minor amount of color bleeding. Then with the RS2X, 2X fill activated, it doesn't look much better, and you now have to deal with the bob deinterlacing of the PS2. And it still has the color bleeding issue. When I then get to the PS2 HDMI, it is a bit overexposed, but otherwise it looks fine. However, something I did notice a lot with this PS2 HDMI converter when I used it is that it adds quite a bit of latency to it that can be noticeable depending on the game. Then the AV2HDMI is overexposed as well and full of artifacts. And on top of that, it's also blurry. It's really the worst solution you could pick in this case. And then I came back to the RS2X with component cables. And those look better than the PS2 to HDMI by a tiny amount, I would say. After that, we have a bit of a weird one with the PlayStation Portable, which does have a video out. On the RS2X, it looks horrendous. I can't even describe it really. It has a lot of flicker, the resolution is horrible, and the white is filled with different colors. It's really not a pleasant way to look at it. Then with the 2X, it looks even worse as it exasperates all the problems. So when you then also move over to the 2X fill, it pretty much just looks the same as without smoothing filters on. Then moving over to the AV2HDMI, it looks much better while also looking much worse at the same time. On one hand, you don't have the colors around the wider areas of the game, but at the same time, it's just not very pleasant looking and has a lot of artifacting. Then lastly, I get to the SNES. The RX2X looks a little bit blurry and has some artifacting around the edges. But other than that, it is quite alright, I would say. Then the RS2X with 2X on makes the image look a little bit crispier, but the artifacting is still there. But it's not as bad anymore. Then the RS2X with the 2X fill on does make the image look blurrier again, but it does look better than the base version in my opinion. And lastly, I tested it with the AV2HDMI. The image is full of artifacts. It is blurry and the colors are completely off. And also there are some weird lines across the screen that almost looks like badly implemented scan lines. Honestly, this is probably the biggest difference on all of the consoles I've tested, where the SNES looks absolutely horrendous on the AV2HDMI and pretty decent on the Retroscaler2X. And then I come to the conclusion. The Retroscaler is quite alright if you don't want to pay too much, but you want to hook up multiple consoles. Because the Retroscaler2X has both versatility and looks alright, all things considered. The AV2HDMI still offers some versatility if your console has composite output, but it just looks horrendous and I think you will turn the console off after 10 minutes, at best. Now, if you have only one console you want to hook up, then I would actually recommend to go with a dedicated device. Because these are quite nice, they don't take too much finicking around, and usually they just straight up go to HDMI without any problems. And they are smaller often. On a side note here, I would recommend to go with the more premium versions of these adapters, as the cheaper ones, like the PS2 HDMI I used here, do introduce a lot of latency. And if you want the best picture and the most versatility, I think then you should go with something like an OSSC. It will cost you quite a bit though, as the OSSC itself costs like $150. Specific SCART cables for all the specific consoles each cost like $40. If you want the best, you will pay the most. But if you want just good enough, I think the Retroscaler2X fills a nice niche between something like this and something like a RetroTink. And as such, it is quite an alright device, I would say, but you should make your own conclusions based on the comparison footage that I've shown throughout the video.